When thoughts no longer reached beyond tomorrow, when plans stopped forming without being rejected, and when the future slowly lost its shape, what happens to a person when nothing ahead feels close enough to imagine? At first, nothing suggested that the future was disappearing because nothing dramatic changed and no decision was made to abandon it, leaving the days to unfold as they always had, quietly and without interruption. The men still woke at the same hours, followed the same routines, and moved through familiar spaces with practiced ease. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, something difficult to notice because it did not announce itself as loss. Thoughts about the days ahead did not vanish suddenly, but they grew shorter, less detailed, and less persistent, appearing briefly before dissolving without resistance. Plans were not canceled, because cancellation implies intention, and what occurred instead was a gradual failure to form them at all, as though the mind no longer found reason to extend itself forward. At first, this felt natural, because planning requires uncertainty, and uncertainty had been reduced by repetition, leaving little incentive to imagine alternatives beyond the present routine. The future did not feel blocked or forbidden, but distant, existing beyond a horizon that no longer invited attention or effort to reach. The men noticed that conversations, when they occurred, rarely touched on what might come next, remaining anchored instead to immediate details that required no projection or commitment. Questions about what would happen later lost their urgency, not because answers were known, but because the questions themselves no longer carried weight. The mind adapted by focusing inward and downward, toward what was directly observable and controllable, releasing thoughts that extended beyond the boundaries of the current day. In this narrowed focus, tomorrow felt abstract, lacking texture or form, making it difficult to engage with emotionally or mentally. The men did not feel hopeless in a dramatic sense, because hopelessness implies awareness of a future denied, and here the future was not denied, but quietly ignored. What unsettled them, though rarely consciously, was the ease with which this ignoring occurred, as though the mental effort required to imagine ahead had begun to outweigh its perceived value. Without milestones to anticipate, time ceased to feel directional, existing instead as a sequence of similar days that neither approached nor departed from anything in particular. The absence of anticipation removed a subtle source of energy, because looking ahead often gives meaning to the present, and without it, the present became self-contained and static. The men found it harder to distinguish between near and far, not in distance, but in relevance, as all future moments seemed equally detached from immediate experience. Plans, when briefly considered, felt insubstantial, unable to hold attention long enough to be developed or remembered. This did not produce anxiety, because anxiety feeds on uncertainty about what lies ahead, and here uncertainty had been replaced by indifference. The men did not argue with this indifference, because it arrived without discomfort, offering a form of mental rest that felt preferable to effortful imagining. As days passed, the habit of looking forward weakened further, making the absence of future thinking feel increasingly normal rather than concerning. The present expanded to fill the space once occupied by projection, leaving little room for speculation or desire to take shape. Without future reference points, memory also began to lose contrast, as the past no longer served as a guide toward what might come next, but merely as background context. The men became skilled at existing within a limited temporal frame, attending to what was immediately required and releasing everything else without regret. This skill did not feel learned, but assumed, as though the mind had simply adjusted its range to match what the environment consistently offered. The future did not end, but it receded quietly, becoming something acknowledged in theory but rarely engaged in practice. By the end of this early phase, planning had not been consciously abandoned, yet it had lost its place within daily thought, leaving the men suspended in a present that no longer pointed forward, and in doing so, had begun to reshape how time itself was experienced. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the future continued to recede quietly from daily thought, the men began to notice that the idea of continuation itself no longer carried the same weight it once had, because continuation depends on direction, and direction had slowly dissolved into the present. Days still followed one another, yet they no longer felt connected by a sense of movement toward anything beyond themselves, existing instead as individual units that repeated without accumulating meaning. The men woke each morning without the subtle expectation that something lay ahead to be reached, completed, or resolved, allowing the day to begin without tension, but also without momentum. This absence of momentum did not feel alarming, because alarm arises when something expected fails to appear, and expectation had already weakened enough that nothing seemed missing. Time no longer felt like a path unfolding forward, but like a surface that extended evenly in all directions, offering no indication of approach or departure. Without a future to orient toward, effort lost its narrative role, because effort often gains significance through what it leads to, and here nothing beyond the present day seemed close enough to justify sustained investment. The men noticed that even imagining progress felt abstract, disconnected from lived experience, as though progress belonged to another context that no longer applied. This detachment from progress altered how they related to persistence, because persistence traditionally implies moving through difficulty toward an outcome, and without an outcome in view, persistence became indistinguishable from mere endurance. Endurance itself lost clarity, because enduring something assumes an eventual end, and the absence of future reference made it difficult to imagine such an end with any emotional substance. The men continued to exist within routine, yet routine no longer felt like preparation for something else, functioning instead as a closed loop that renewed itself without advancing. In this loop, continuation became automatic rather than chosen, sustained by habit rather than intention, and habit rarely invites reflection on where it leads. The sense of carrying something forward weakened, because there was nothing ahead that required carrying, leaving experience to settle into a steady present without trajectory. This change affected how the men thought about themselves within time, as identity often stretches between memory and anticipation had grown faint. Without anticipation, the self felt less extended, confined to the immediate moment and the immediate needs of routine, reducing the sense of being in motion through a larger life. The men did not feel trapped in time, because entrapment implies awareness of confinement, and awareness had softened into acceptance of repetition. What they experienced instead was a gentle flattening of experience, where the distinction between continuing and merely repeating became increasingly difficult to discern. Moments no longer felt like steps within a sequence, but like complete units that neither contributed to nor detracted from anything beyond themselves. This completeness of the present reduced the emotional pull of what came next, because what came next felt no different from what was already here. The men found it harder to care about how long things might last, because duration without direction offered no clear meaning to measure. As a result, time ceased to be something moved through and became something inhabited, an environment rather than a process. In this environment, continuation did not feel purposeful or burdensome, but neutral, something that happened without needing to be understood or justified. The absence of future planning thus reshaped not only thought, but experience itself, turning life into a series of self-contained days that did not add up to a story. The men continued to function within this structure, neither resisting nor questioning it, because questioning requires an alternative to compare against, and alternatives had quietly disappeared. By the end of this phase, continuation had lost its meaning as movement towards something else, becoming instead a simple persistence of the present, where time moved forward without offering direction, and where living continued without asking what it was continuing toward. As the sense of future direction continued to fade, the men gradually discovered that choice itself had begun to lose its urgency, because choice draws its meaning from consequence, and consequence depends on something that lies ahead. Decisions still occurred throughout the day, yet they felt smaller, flatter, and less connected to any lasting effect, as though choosing one option over another no longer altered the shape of what followed. The men noticed that many actions unfolded automatically, guided by routine rather than deliberation, because deliberation requires imagining outcomes, and imagining outcomes had become increasingly difficult. In this state, choice no longer felt like an assertion of will, but like a minor adjustment within a fixed pattern, something that did not extend beyond the moment in which it occurred. The absence of future reference points weakened the internal process that once weighed options against what they might lead to, leaving decisions to be made based on ease rather than intention. What once might have prompted careful consideration now resolved itself quickly, not because answers were obvious, but because nothing seemed to depend on them. The men did not feel stripped of choice, because stripping implies force, and what occurred instead was a quiet diminishing of its relevance, allowing decisions to pass without emotional engagement. In many moments, the difference between choosing and not choosing felt negligible because both led to the same immediate continuation of routine. This neutrality made indecision rare, not because clarity had increased, but because the cost of deciding incorrectly had disappeared along with the future it might have affected. The men found themselves less inclined to pause before acting, not out of confidence, but because pausing suggested a weight that no longer existed. Without a future to shape, choice ceased to function as a bridge between present and possibility, collapsing inward until it served only to maintain the existing flow of the day. This collapse altered how responsibility was felt, because responsibility often extends forward toward what might result, and here there was little to project responsibility onto. Actions still occurred, yet they no longer felt owned in the same way, appearing instead as responses to immediate circumstance rather than expressions of preference or intent. The men experienced a subtle distancing from their own decisions, observing themselves act without fully identifying with the act itself, as though choice had become impersonal. This impersonal quality reduced both regret and satisfaction, because both rely on comparison with alternative futures that were no longer imagined. Even moments that once might have felt significant lost their distinction, blending into the continuous present where nothing seemed to stand out as more consequential than anything else. The absence of future planning thus flattened not only time, but agency, leaving the men with fewer reasons to invest emotionally in the outcomes of their own actions. They did not feel powerless, because powerlessness implies a desire to act differently, and desire itself had weakened along with the habit of imagining ahead. Instead, they occupied a state where acting and not acting felt equally sufficient, both serving only to extend the present without altering its character. Choice became something that happened, rather than something that was exercised, a subtle but profound shift that further reduced engagement with the idea of self-directed life. As this condition persisted, the men adapted to a mode of existence where decision-making required minimal effort and carried minimal significance, conserving energy at the cost of involvement. This adaptation felt efficient rather than harmful, because efficiency often masks loss when loss unfolds without pain. By the end of this phase, choice had not vanished, but it had withdrawn from its former role as a shaping force, leaving behind a quieter existence in which decisions no longer pointed forward, but simply maintained the present, reinforcing a life lived without expectation of what might come next. As choice continued to withdraw from daily experience, responsibility followed quietly behind it, because responsibility depends on the sense that actions extend beyond the moment in which they occur, and that extension had grown faint. The men still fulfilled basic expectations, followed routines, and responded when required. Yet these actions no longer felt tied to a deeper obligation, unfolding instead as simple continuations of habit. Responsibility did not disappear, but it changed its texture, becoming lighter and less defined, no longer anchored to outcomes that lay ahead or to consequences imagined in the future. Without a future to orient toward, responsibility lost its forward pull, settling into the present as a minimal requirement rather than a sustained commitment. The men noticed that completing tasks, when they appeared, felt less like fulfilling a duty and more like closing a moment, something done so that the day could proceed without interruption. This shift did not produce neglect, because neglect implies awareness of what is being ignored, and here awareness itself had narrowed, leaving little room for such distinction. Responsibility ceased to feel personal, no longer experienced as something carried by the self, but as something that arose briefly and then dissolved once addressed. The absence of long-term consequence weakened the sense that actions mattered beyond their immediate completion, making it difficult to invest in them emotionally or morally. The men did not feel relieved by this change, nor did they feel troubled, existing instead within a neutral state where responsibility neither burdened nor motivated. In this neutrality, accountability lost clarity, because accountability often refers forward to judgment or evaluation, and judgment without a future reference felt abstract and distant. Actions were taken because they were required in the moment, not because they aligned with a broader sense of purpose or obligation. The men found it easier to comply than to commit, because compliance ends with the action itself, while commitment extends beyond it. An extension had become increasingly difficult to imagine. As responsibility narrowed, so did the sense of carrying something over time, leaving each day to stand alone without accumulating weight. This narrowing reduced inner conflict, because conflict often arises when obligation clashes with desire, and desire had already weakened under the absence of future planning. The men experienced a form of calm that came from lowered expectation, where doing what was necessary felt sufficient, and nothing more was asked or expected. Even self-responsibility softened, as the idea of shaping oneself toward a future state lost relevance in a world where future states were rarely considered. The men no longer thought in terms of becoming something else, because becoming implies movement toward a different condition, and movement had flattened into repetition. Responsibility thus transformed from a guiding principle into a momentary response, appearing only when demanded by the present and vanishing immediately afterward. This transformation did not feel like a failure, because failure requires standards measured across time, and such standards had grown indistinct. What remained was a minimal form of responsibility that ensured continuity without aspiration, sufficient to keep life functioning but insufficient to give it direction. The men adapted to this form easily, because it required little emotional investment and offered predictability in return. Over time, the idea of responsibility as something that shaped life beyond the present moment became increasingly remote, replaced by a simpler understanding that doing enough was enough. By the end of this phase, responsibility no longer served as a bridge between action and future consequence, but as a quiet mechanism that kept the present moving forward without asking why or toward what, reinforcing a way of living in which obligation existed only long enough to be completed and then forgotten. As responsibility settled fully into the present and lost its reach beyond the moment, the men entered a condition in which living without planning no longer felt temporary or incomplete, but sufficient in itself, because nothing in their experience suggested that something more was required. The absence of future orientation no longer registered as a loss, because loss depends on comparison, and comparison had gradually disappeared along with the habit of looking ahead. Days unfolded smoothly within their narrow frame, each one beginning and ending without reference to what might follow, allowing life to function without projection or anticipation. The men did not feel suspended between past and future, because the future no longer exerted a pull strong enough to create tension, leaving the present to stand on its own. In this state, the idea of planning felt foreign, not forbidden or avoided, but irrelevant, like a skill designed for conditions that no longer existed. Thoughts about what might come next appeared occasionally, yet they carried no urgency and dissolved quickly, unable to attach themselves to emotion or intention. The mind adapted completely to this limited temporal range, conserving energy by releasing the effort required to imagine or prepare for outcomes that no longer felt meaningful. Living became an exercise in continuity rather than direction, sustained by routine and immediate response rather than by goals or expectations. The men found a quiet stability in this mode because stability does not require movement, only consistency, and consistency had become abundant. This stability was not comforting in a conventional sense, but it was predictable, and predictability offered a form of security that replaced aspiration. Without plans to guide action, behavior aligned naturally with what was easiest to maintain, reinforcing patterns that required minimal decision and minimal reflection. The absence of planning also reduced internal conflict, because conflict often arises when present actions are measured against future desires, and future desires had grown faint. The men no longer experienced urgency to change their condition, because change implies an improvement imagined ahead, and improvement no longer carried emotional weight. What once might have felt like stagnation now felt like equilibrium, a balanced state in which nothing pressed forward and nothing pulled back. The self adjusted to this equilibrium by shrinking its scope, focusing on endurance rather than development, on presence rather than progression. In this narrowed existence, the concept of becoming someone else lost relevance, because becoming requires time to be seen as a path rather than a surface. The men continued to exist fully within each day, yet without the sense that these days contributed to a larger arc or story. This lack of narrative did not feel troubling, because narrative requires attention to sequence and outcome, and attention had settled into the immediate. Living without a future thus became not a deprivation, but a condition that sustained itself through repetition, offering enough structure to persist and too little contrast to provoke change. By this point, the absence of planning was no longer noticed, because noticing would have required stepping outside the present, and stepping outside the present had become unnecessary. The men remained capable of imagining a future in theory, yet that capability no longer influenced how they lived, existing separately from daily experience. In this final stage, life no longer pointed forward, but it did not collapse inward either, occupying a steady middle space where time passed without direction and without resistance. By the end of this phase, stopping plans for the future had not led to despair or breakdown, but to a quiet completion of the present, a state in which living continued smoothly without asking what it was continuing toward, and in doing so revealed how deeply the future itself had withdrawn from their inner world. In the end, nothing officially ended, because there was no moment when planning was abandoned or the future was rejected, only a gradual quiet in which looking ahead stopped feeling necessary. Life continued within the present, shaped by routine rather than expectation, moving forward without direction and without resistance. What had once been imagined no longer pressed for attention, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer felt close enough to matter. And so the future did not disappear, but withdrew quietly, leaving behind a way of living that asked nothing beyond the moment itself. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.